90% of vendors in this field add value, are honest, either measure validly, or if they're measuring invalidly, they don't realize they're measuring validly. But the problem is that 90% of the business in healthcare goes to the other 10%. So the mission, it's very clear to create an efficient market where valid competence and validity are rewarded so that 90% of those vendors can get 90% of the business instead of 10%.
Root is the functional medicine benefit for employers who are looking to help their people solve and prevent health issues at the root cause and lower their healthcare costs. Welcome back to the Get to the Root podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Erica Armstrong, and today I'm joined by our guest, Al Lewis. Al Lewis is the founder and Validator-in-Chief of the Validation Institute, author of 2 seminal books on vendor outcomes management, and universally recognized as the leading authority on that subject. So thank you, Al, for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me on. As you know, I'm a big fan of yours and happy to join the podcast.
Well, thank you. The feeling's mutual. Can you share with the audience a little bit about your background and then what ultimately led for you to get into the employee benefits space?
Yeah, so I was originally in the utilization review space, and that was kind of a sketchy business. And I was able to kind of segue out of that into disease management at very early days of disease management, where that seemed like it was going to solve a lot of problems, and kind of rode that curve up. In fact, I wasn't just drinking the Kool-Aid, I was mixing it up and selling the Kool-Aid. And then one day I got challenged by an actuary who said my numbers were wrong, and that in fact, disease management saved much more than I said it did. So I knew he was wrong. So I simply ran a little calculation on my methodology and his methodology. And yeah, his methodology, he's actuaries, they should stick to predicting risk and not try to measure vendor outcomes. In any case, it turned out that in the process of discovering that his stuff was wrong, I discovered that my stuff was wrong. Not as wrong by a long shot, but wrong. And so the next time I spoke at a conference, I said, we've been measuring outcomes all wrong. And it actually turns out the savings are, much more modest than we thought. When there was a blogger in the audience, picked it up, and he wrote a blog, quite circulated time. You still find it online. It says, "Founding father of disease management astonishingly declares, my kid is ugly." So the 2 publicly traded disease management companies fell. Their stock price fell like 30% in a week. It continued to go down after that. The field kind of went away, and I needed something else to do. And so I looked at wellness. Okay, so wellness, I said, wellness must save money because everybody says it saves money. Well, it turns out wellness is an even bigger crock than disease management was. It cost 10 times as much and actually lost money as opposed to not making money. So that didn't get me a lot of friends in the wellness industry. And also, it wasn't terribly good for your consulting business. I mean, you put a program in and you get these residuals. You take a program out, you don't get anything, right? But I knew I was measuring the outcomes right. And then somebody that I knew from disease management, a guy by the name of Sean Slavinsky, was running a joint venture of Intel and General Electric that at the time were the 2 largest companies in the U.S., And they started this joint venture to measure outcomes it's kind of I fall and I can't get up company. Like they would put sensors in people's houses, frail Medicare, and get notified when something happened. And he said, "Al, we're losing business. We lose bids because our competitors, they're allowed to lie. And we're not allowed to lie because we're owned by Intel and GE. Could you start some kind of validation institute or something and be the arbiter of these things, and we'll give you the budget to get going and everything." And he said, "Yeah, sure, as long as we're validating, post-acute care. Why don't we just validate everything?" Said, "Yeah, sure, let's do it." So they financed it and owned it for a while. And the irony, the irony was that during the time that they were in this business, which they subsequently got out of, they were never able to get validated by their own validation institute because the numbers just didn't add up. I would say, "Sean, you can't give me these numbers and expect me to validate it, and to his and G and Intel's, credit, they didn't force it, or they didn't say, look, we're going to pull your funding or anything like that. They said, well, we'll try to get better numbers. And actually one of their competitors did provide good numbers. They were validating it. And you wonder why Intel and GE's, their stock price fell like 90% in 10 years. It's stuff like that. So ultimately, Sean left, and Intel and GE look and say, why do we own this validation institute? And they sold it to somebody else who grew the revenues. I'm not going to mention the first name, because I'm going to say they were not a good manager. I mean, they had ridiculous amounts of staff and a lot of sloppiness, but they grew the revenues. They basically proved the business model. They were losing money, so they decided to get out of the business, and they tried to sell it. Nobody wanted this business because it lost money, and they couldn't sell it. So he says, well, I'll give it to you, and you just pay me on an earnout. So I said, fine. So Crucify bought it, and that's how we got back into business.
Awesome. That's a really cool story. So how long ago was that it originally started?
Well, it is funny because we are in the business of knowing our numbers exactly, and I can't actually tell you the exact year. It was either 2013 or 2014.
Oh, okay. So yes, you've been around for a while, and then you've
Yes.
been running the Validation Institute and
Well,
validating.
well, I ran it
Mhm.
originally for GE and Intel, and then they sold it, and I didn't run it. I was just an
Okay.
advisor for the last year and a half I've been running.
Okay. Great. And now that you are back in charge, what is the mission and purpose of the Validation Institute?
Well, in one sentence, and by the way, just for the record, I'm not the actual CEO anymore. I'm 70 years old. I handed over the reins to somebody, frankly, that's a much better job than I do in most respects. It can be summed up in one sentence, which is that 90% of vendors in this field add value, are honest, either measure validly, or if they're measuring invalidly, they don't realize they're measuring validly. But the problem is that 90% of the business in healthcare goes to the other 10%. So the mission, it's very clear to create an efficient market where valid competence and validity are rewarded, so that 90% of those vendors can get 90% of the business instead of 10%.
I love that. That's such a great answer. And so you recently validated Root's model of care.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that validation and what it means for both our
Yes.
company partners and for Root?
Okay, so Root compared participants to non-participants. Now, normally, that is a non-starter in validation because participants will always outperform non-participants. The difference and the reason that yours was valid, and there are also a couple other companies and other industries where, for instance, if you get on insulin, you never get off insulin, whether or not you participate in the program. It was the same exact situation with Root, and the people who get on the type of specialty drugs, high-cost drugs that folks are on who come into your program never get off, or rarely get off. So the fact that you are able to get quite a number of these folks off means there's no participation bias, because they wouldn't have gotten off otherwise. So yours was a very easy validation to do.
Well, thank you. And so the standard of care in conventional medicine for autoimmune conditions is to make the diagnosis and then find the medication that matches that diagnosis, and then either escalate the dose or change the medication until the symptoms are managed, and then keep them on long-term management. So it's not really in the path for a rheumatologist to say, hey, it's time to come off of this med. It's okay, your symptoms are controlled. We've got the right med. Let's stay the course. And at Root, we are focused on root causes. And so we look at autoimmune conditions quite differently. We look at, there's a triad. So there's genetics, there is an environmental trigger. Sometimes that's stress, sometimes that's hormone change, very common in the perimenopause or postpartum years, or a virus. And then there's intestinal permeability, or the layman's term is leaky gut. And so when we put that picture together and actually solve root causes, the reason that people are coming off of autoimmune medication is that they no longer need them. And it's very carefully supervised by physicians who track not only symptoms, but laboratory markers as well. And it's coordinated with their rheumatologist. And so that everyone in the care team is on the same page.
Yeah, and we don't so much look at what's inside the box that you've just described, though we do look at it. We don't judge you on that. We judge you on the fact people did come off. And the thing about autoimmune conditions is that diseases, that they're not part of the human condition. Very few people had them 100 years ago. It's got to be environmental triggers. You say, leaky gut. I mean, like Splenda, for example, can cause leaky gut syndrome. There's also microplasma. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff. And if you do get to those root causes, there's no surprise. It's not a surprise that the doctors are able to de-prescribe things that they never thought they'd be able to de-prescribe.
Yes, thanks, Al. It's one of those conditions that just keeps rising year over year. It's one of the main areas that we help with at Root. But the nice thing about Root is, we've had thousands of patients. Not all of them have autoimmune conditions. So we had to focus in on just one area for to make the numbers be readable and to give a true validation in one area, although we help in many other areas as well, like metabolic and hormone and gut health, but they're all tied in.
Yeah, I mean, so what I would say to that is that you proved it in the area which is most difficult to prove it in, which means that it is likely that a participants versus non-participants comparison in the easier areas would show results of the program much more than the results of the participation bias. And the example I give for baseball fans is you are able to hit, sliders on the corners, which would be the toughest pitches, right? Which would be the autoimmune conditions. And showing that, it can easily be inferred that you would be able to hit fastballs that come down the middle.
Thanks, Al. That's a good analogy. So what is on the radar for Validation Institute? What do you have coming up?
Well, we have come out of the era of essentially creating and honing the products, and now it's just a question of basically becoming the industry standard. So that, say, 3 or 4 years ago, if a company was validated, people would say, well, what's the Validation Institute? We still get that, but there's a lot more that people will say to another company, how come you're not validated and they are? And for several reasons. One is that we're much better known now. We're much bigger. We have this, I think I could send it to anybody who asks, but we have the best 90-second street cred story, and no actuarial firm can match, which is that we get a prominent readout in Marty Carey's book. Of course, he's no longer the FDA commissioner, but was. I wrote the 2 books on the field, and we're in a Harvard Business School case study as well. And if you take the first and the last of those, the Marty's book and the HBS case study, that makes us the only organization in healthcare and possibly the only thing of any kind that the Trump administration agreed with Harvard on. Of course, he got fired. That might have been why he got fired for agreeing with Harvard. We have the street cred. We've got but the other thing we have that you have as Root is we have this RISA immunity guarantee. RISA lawsuits are skyrocketing. And what we are saying is that anybody who gets our validation, their employers will essentially be immune from these lawsuits involving you as a vendor. Because you're not, it's not a failure of due diligence to manage a health benefit by using you. And so one thing that we're doing, and this is actually, we haven't even formally announced this yet, but we're going to, is that we're taking that $100,000 RISA immunity guarantee and moving it to $1 million for organizations that want to pay an extra fairly small amount of money to do that. Because frankly, if you're going after big companies, they could care less about $100,000 immunity. They want to know it. So we are doing everything we can to, number one, have a much bigger footprint. Number two, to the extent we have a big footprint, which we do, making sure people see the footprint. And number three, back to the mission, trying to help those 90% of vendors that have something to add to the society to get more in 10% business.
That's awesome. And then in doing that, you're enabling access to the best care and resources for all the employees. Thanks, Al. So to wrap up our podcast today, where can people go to learn more about your work and the Validation Institute, and where to catch you next time?
Well, it's very easy. It's validationinstitute.com. You can write to me, Al, at validationinstitute.com. And that's it. I'm pretty findable on LinkedIn anyway.
Well, thanks so much, Al.
Well, thank you for having me on, Eric.